Hello, I'm Benedict Beckeld. Free will is one of the most intractable and contentious issues in the history of philosophy. Free will is usually understood as meaning that one could have chosen differently under identical circumstances. This definition derives from Immanuel Kant, and though there are other possible definitions, this is the most common one and what most people mean when they talk about free will. It holds that one's actions arise from an independent faculty of the will, and that this will is free by not operating under necessitating natural or physical laws. According to this view, the processes of natural causality in the world and within persons may push the will in a certain direction, but without necessitating it to move in that direction. Even though in modern times most philosophers have finally come around to recognizing that free will is an illusion, there has been a certain reluctance or squeamishness to admit that we are not free in this sense, as if it were the task of philosophers to tell people simply what sounds reassuring and comforting rather than the truth. On the contrary, I think that we philosophers should be proud of the fact that society has shown an obstinate tendency of executing or at least banishing us. Even David Hume, one of my philosophical heroes, almost feels obliged to confirm the existence of free will, even though everything he has said about it indicates that it is not free. Namely, that a human being could only have made a different decision if he had had different convictions and characteristics than the ones that he actually does have, which is to say, if he had been a different person than the one he actually is. Hume denies free will, but cannot bring himself to actually say the words. So too, the young Wittgenstein yields to the same temptation. He says, free will consists in the fact that future actions cannot be known now, which is also similar to what a contemporary philosopher on the topic, Daniel Dennett, would say. So my point is, then please don't call it free will, because what you're describing is clearly not free. You're changing the definition in order to be able to defend it. So I shall state it plainly. Free will is a metaphysical and highly unscientific illusion. In order to understand this, let's look a bit at the history of this notion, and then examine the most common argument against the denial of free will. We can isolate three basic phases in that history. 1. Philosophers had no conception of free will either way. This is early to mid-antiquity. 2. Most philosophers defended free will, late antiquity, Middle Ages, and early modern period. And finally, 3. Most philosophers deny or redefine free will, and this is late modern and present times. So most philosophers today, in spite of their squeamishness, understand that free will is an illusion. Those who defend free will today are mostly theologians and religious philosophers. So in the beginning of this history, in the first historical phase, in the archaic and classical Greek world, there is no independent faculty of the will. In the Iliad and the Odyssey, for example, if someone changes his mind or decides upon some particular course of action, Homer simply explains formulaically in Greek as follows, entaut alle noese, which means he or she then thought other things. This does not require a separate part of the human organism called will, to say nothing of a free will. Our common feeling that this lack of free will would lessen the worth of our actions has been ingrained in us by almost 2,000 years of Judeo-Christian philosophy. But more on this later. The earliest, more substantial textual passages with the first seeds of free will come with Plato and Aristotle. The most significant passage in Plato in this regard is his famous Myth of Air in Book 10 of the Republic, which describes the reincarnation of the soul and how the dead can choose what their next lives will be like. We find here the two crucial words theos and naitios. God is not responsible, or more literally, God is not the cause of the soul's choice when they choose their next lives, but only the souls themselves are. Aristotle, for his part, in Book 3 of the Nicomachean Ethics, speaks of choice, preference, and will, and he explicitly connects responsibility with the freedom of the agent in choosing his course of action. So this might sound like free will, but words like freedom, choice, and will mean something else here than when they will later be used or expressed by Christian and Kantian thinkers. Because, for instance, from Plato's Republic, we can glean that the soul's choices are dependent on their previous experiences, and Aristotle's discussion of freedom involves merely physical freedom. You are responsible for your action if no one compelled you to do it, if there was no external force, but this doesn't say anything about metaphysical mental freedom to act. In the Hellenistic Greek era, so a little bit later, the Stoics are very deterministically minded in that they believe God, in the form of divine breath, controls everything in a pantheistic fashion. They think that everything is fate, that is, everything is determined through a chain or a network of causes. Even later Stoics in the early Roman Empire, like Seneca and Epictetus, have no notion of free will. They speak much of responsibility and proper action, but that something is dependent on us is again meant physically only. We are responsible for the things that fall within our physical bailiwick, as it were. There is never any suggestion that we are metaphysically free, that our minds can move independently of physical causality. That thought does not yet appear to exist in the history of philosophy. So this is the first era of the history of free will, when, properly speaking, the notion did not even exist, which is to say it is actually a form of prehistory in the history of free will. We now enter into the second phase of this history in late antiquity. Around 200 AD, which is also when the first major crop of Greek and Latin church fathers arose, there is a change in how freedom is understood. The Aristotelian commentator Alexander of Aphrodisias misconstrues Aristotle's conception of freedom by understanding it in a way that had not started to develop until after Aristotle, during the 500 years that separate Alexander from Aristotle. So Alexander does not use the term freedom in the same sense as had Aristotle. Various terms are often identical, but their meanings change over time, misleading some people into assuming that we are dealing with the same things in different eras if the same word is used for them. So, as very often in philosophy, much comes down to shifting semantic fields. Alexander believes in his work on fate that it would be blasphemous to say that divine nature has endowed us differently, and thus that divine nature would constrain us into particular action, whereas for Aristotle, it had been obvious that nature has gifted us differently. And so in describing freedom to human beings, independently of physical causality, independently of nature, Alexander of Aphrodisias takes a long step away from Aristotle and from the more pagan physical outlook and toward a real conception of free will. As I mentioned, the Christians arise in this period, and to them, on the whole, or at least to the Latin, if not to the Greek church fathers, freedom finally becomes free will, liberum arbitrium, as Augustine calls it in Latin. Freedom now comes to mean more or less, anyway, what it's going to be to Kant later on, namely metaphysical freedom, a freedom insisting that there is justice to the world insofar as responsibility can finally be connected to free agency. Again, in earlier and pagan Greek thought, freedom is more a question of what is physically possible, of what one chooses to do without external constraints, but not of what one chooses to do in a metaphysically free way, because there is no such thing to the Greeks. It's not that the Greeks would have denied it if one had asked them the question, that they would have rejected this notion of metaphysical freedom, but rather that it would not even have occurred to them in the first place, because the pagan universe doesn't require it. That universe takes a much more tragic and non-utopian view of life, and so it's certainly not a coincidence that Plato, who took the first little step toward free will in the myth of error, as I mentioned, that he was also philosophy's first political utopianist, because the insistence on free will is the insistence on an underlying fairness to the world, right? We insist that the world is fair because you get what you deserve if you chose freely. And so that fairness, which is thought to underlie the world, is then to be implemented in human society as well, where everything must become perfect. And so there is that connection between Plato's utopian political project and the fact that he took a step toward free will as well. It is the Christians, with some help from the late Peripatetics like Alexander of Aphrodisias and also from the Neoplatonists, who create the concept of free will and tie it to responsibility, so that bad actions can be tied to free will and not to God. Now, of course, Christians is a very large term now, so in fairness to them, there were some Christian subgroups who also denied free will due to the idea of original sin, and most notably among these we have John Calvin and the Calvinists, but they did not win out in the intra-Christian struggle for theological dominance, and so it's still fair to say, by and large, that Christianity played that crucial role in the invention of free will. Now, as philosophers started to shuffle off their theological coil and to become less metaphysically minded in the modern era, it was normal that they would finally see through the illusion of free will in the last and third phase of this history, as I have already discussed, even if those philosophers were sometimes unwilling to admit it.